When I talked about the monastic gathering, I was mentioning one discussion group that we had about traditional Dharma and Bhikkhu Bodhi called secular Dharma. And so I thought just to go over a few of the things and some more. I won't go exactly according to what he said because, of course, I have my own ideas on this. Yeah, but there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so first of all, talking about just the human condition. Traditional Dharma talks about beginningless samsara, past and future lives under the influence of karma and afflictions, and then therefore the possibility of attaining nirvana by overcoming the basic fundamental cause of ignorance. Whereas secular Buddhism talks more about just this life and our immediate life. There's usually either no discussion about past and future lives or an outright rejection of past and future lives, including other realms, something which traditional Buddhism accepts. And at the Western Buddhist teachers meeting that I attended maybe 3 years ago in Garrison, I was really surprised by how many people who called themselves Buddhist teachers, when it was asked if they believed in rebirth, did not raise their hands. There was about half of them who said either they didn't believe in rebirth or were unsure about it. And yet, from a traditional viewpoint, this is like taken for granted. It's the bedrock. The whole thing doesn't make sense without there being rebirth. Yeah, if it's just this lifetime and there's nothing after this lifetime, then, not a lot makes sense. Okay, then talking about the conception of the Buddha, traditional Buddhists talk about there being many Buddhas. Even in Theravada, they talk about the preceding Buddhas, and they're mentioned in the Buddha Vamsa and the Bodhisattva path, and how they all started out as ordinary beings, and then through breaking through the ignorance, realized, the ultimate truth, and how they gained all these incredible abilities because of doing so, and had many superpowers, were able to make many manifestations, to benefit sentient beings. For the secular Dharma, then there's no talk about a multi-life, bodhisattvas practicing for many lifetimes, because they don't talk about many lifetimes, okay? And so they talk about the Buddha as a human being, who was born at that historical time, who kind of woke up to the reality of existence. But they don't really talk about him as being omniscient or having superpowers or emanating bodies to pure lands and, manifesting different places in the universe to benefit sentient beings. They don't have that idea of the Buddha. He was just a man and attained awakening and, which made him, wiser than others and stopped his own suffering in this life. But that was kind of it. Okay? So therefore there's a difference in attitude towards the Buddha. So from the traditionalist viewpoint, you have a lot more faith and confidence in the Buddha as an incomparable teacher. Some people also kind of deify the Buddha, something like that, but not everybody. But people really trust the Buddha, take refuge in him, and see the Buddha as a role model for what we want to become over, of course, a period of many lifetimes. So the secular people see the Buddha as just an excellent teacher, but not necessarily somebody who's unique. And they if they take refuge in him, it's in order to stop the gross suffering that exists right now. Okay? Because for the secular Buddhists, the gross suffering is the ouch suffering, what physically hurts or what people recognize as mentally painful. Whereas for and sometimes they may talk about the suffering of change, that whatever happiness you have kind of goes away. But they don't really see that as a fact of the human condition. It's something maybe that can be modified if you practice the Dharma, so that, you may have suffering, but maybe it doesn't hurt quite as much. Whereas from the traditional viewpoint, they talk not only about the painful suffering and the unsatisfactoriness of things that change, but also the fact that we have the five aggregates that exist under the force of ignorance, afflictions, and karma, and that in and of itself is just the nature of samsara, and that's not going to change no matter what conditions you change in samsara, So the Buddha is, from a traditional viewpoint, you see the Buddha as the one who leads you out of just that basic suffering of having a body and mind that are like our body and mind, Whereas from the secular viewpoint, it's like it's not that bad, It's like there's ways to make the body happy. There's maybe science can overcome some of the physical sufferings that we have, and Buddhism can help us overcome some of our mental suffering. And then they also say that psychology is really important, and the Buddha's not kind of the final refuge, but people really can benefit from psychology. I think some traditionalists agree with that, but maybe the weight they place on the importance of therapy, there might be some difference in that. Okay, in terms of the Dharma itself and the canon and the text, from the traditional viewpoint, people really have a lot of devotion to the text and treat them respectfully and see them as actually describing the path to awakening. And so, a lot of study of the texts and memorization of them and really contemplation of them, and sometimes even a ritual devotion to the text. His Holiness often comments about that. Oh, you put all the sutras on the wall and then pray to them, but you never read them. His Holiness not think that's so good, but that exists in the traditional sphere. From the secular Buddhists, some of them are interested in the texts and want to study. Others are actually kind of anti-intellectual and say it's just a lot of words and you get tangled up in more words and more intellectual knowledge. And they put the emphasis on meditation and personal experience. Yeah, and that kind of like that. And of course there's no devotion to the texts or using them as objects of devotion or ritualistic kind of aspects with the text. In terms of Dharma as the doctrine, the traditional approach is the Four Noble Truths, and that really knowing them is the domain of having ultimate realization. Whereas for the secular people, it's dukkha is experiential suffering, and the Four Truths are seen as like a therapeutic formula, but kind of not as describing the path to liberation or something like that. But you can make analogies of the Four Noble Truths to how to improve things in this lifetime. The traditionalists, of course, accept karma and rebirth. The secular people in general don't accept it, or like I was saying before, either say it's irrelevant or unnecessary because the emphasis is on this life. in terms of dependent origination in the 12 links, the traditionalists really see it happening over a period of many lifetimes. The secularists see it as describing mental events in this particular lifetime only. Okay, and they stress it as just kind of things are interdependent, that kind of meaning. The three characteristics, impermanence, dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, emptiness, and overcoming those in the wrong views regarding those leads to liberation. That's the traditionalists. For the secularists, it's more to reduce the suffering and give you guidelines for how to live without so much of the overt suffering that people have. Yeah? And so using the Dharma as ways to change your mind so that you can accept things, and relying on medicine and science to change some of the physical suffering. In terms of practice, the traditionalists really emphasize that Dharma brings happiness of this life as a byproduct of working for happiness of future lives, aiming for liberation, aiming for full awakening. Whereas for the secularists, the idea of liberation, full awakening, liberation is kind of, future lives they don't even think about. Liberation, they think about in terms of this life, being free of the gross sufferings in this life. And they see it as a much more psychological thing. Nothing to do with it, because in the traditionalists it means being free of a body like this that gets old and sick and dies. Whereas for the secularists, there's an acceptance of, there's this body, and we're not trying to overcome this body or have any kind of mental body or body of light or anything like that. In terms of the Sangha, the traditionalists really focus on the Arya Sangha, those who have realized emptiness directly and have faith and confidence in them, take refuge in them, and see the monastic community as a symbol or representative of the Arya Sangha, and so have a lot of reverence for the monastic community. The secularists don't really think much about the Arya Sangha, or if they do, their importance is minimalized. Monastics may be accepted as teachers, but they see lay people as being able to be just as good teachers and have just as good practice as monastics. Traditionalists usually see that the monastics, were given the task of really preserving and memorizing and mastering the teachings to pass them down to future generations. The secular people don't see the monastics in that way, and sometimes even disparage monastic life, saying that, people are trying to, not pay attention to their sexuality, and that marriage can be just a good an arena for practice as living as a monastic. Okay, in terms of Dharma and society, the traditionalists often keep a distance from society. Some people even say we shouldn't vote or we shouldn't get involved in social engagement projects because, the main thing is to free yourself from samsara. The secular approach is very much for social involvement, voting, bringing Buddhism into the world in a way that can really benefit people in the here and now, and influencing politics, influencing climate change, influencing poverty, and so on. Okay, some other things in terms of organizational structure. Traditionalists tend, at least in Asia, to be very top-down. Yeah, whereas the secularists tend to be emphasize very much everybody's equal. Yeah, sometimes, it goes pretty far, just kind of, you're brand new to the Dharma, but your vote or whatever is equal to even people who've been around for a long time, who have more education. In terms of finances and economics, the traditionalists do things very much based on, practically exclusively based on dana, and just, teachings are freely offered, accommodation is freely offered, and relying on people to be generous, to support the institutions that support the Dharma. The secularists very often charge for teachings, or if the teachings are done by dana, by donation basis, it will influence where they go and who they teach, because very often the secularists has families to support, and so if it's done by dana, you need to go to places where people can give you a lot of dana so you can support your spouse and kids. For traditionalists, there isn't that kind of concern. They may support the monastery, but the supporting monastics costs much less than supporting a lay life of a family. Okay, so those are some of the differences. It was interesting because the discussion really emphasized that all of us are probably not exclusively one or exclusively the other, but are somewhere in the middle, or on certain of these different points we may be more towards one side, on other points we may be more towards the other side. But it was quite an interesting discussion because, how Buddhism spreads in the West is going to depend very much on these kind of views that different people have, and how open the people from the different sides are to views that are different than theirs. In other words, if one side puts down the other side, or vice versa, or if there comes to be, despite these different views of what Buddhism is, if there comes to be mutual respect, or at least mutual tolerance, without people putting down the people who do things differently than they do. Okay, and yet, really being able to see what are the benefits from one side in terms of the Dharma lasting for a long time in the traditional way that the Buddha taught the scriptures, and also how is Dharma, in the modern age going to adjust to different cultures that have different values and different priorities. And, if we don't adjust, are we putting ourselves out of business, or putting the Dharma out of business? People won't resonate with the Dharma if it's presented in a certain way that does not sync with their culture. But how do we sync it with people's culture, but not change the actual teachings? So I think a lot of those topics are really involved in this whole discussion and in, this comparison between the different ways of seeing things. Yeah. So I think there's a lot to think about here and a lot to discuss. And probably amongst us, there will be different views on many of these kinds of things. Yeah. How do they view nirvana? I'm not quite sure how the secularists view nirvana. Probably as just a very peaceful state where you have very deep concentration and some wisdom. But, what they see the wisdom overcoming, I'm not quite sure. Because some of them, some of them who study the text have an idea about what ignorance is. Other ones, the idea of what ignorance is and therefore what wisdom overcomes may not be as clear. Yeah? And some of the secularists don't really teach emptiness or selflessness. Yeah? Or if they do, it's maybe more from a psychological viewpoint. And what do they say happened to the Buddha at Parinirvana? He died. Yeah? Because if you only, emphasize this lifetime and you're not talking more about others, then you don't really have a position about what happens after death. It's just, he died and we don't know, it's a mystery, or, something like that. Yeah? Because they're using Dharma very much, for, in many of the ways, if it's used, for overcoming pain, physical pain, or psychological pain, or, because like mindfulness is really widespread in psychology and taught as something really separate from Buddhism, although some people consider themselves that if they teach mindfulness, then they're a Buddhist teacher, not understanding that there's more to Buddhism than mindfulness, or extracting the meditation technique out of the whole framework of the Four Noble Truths. And so it benefits people that way when you learn the meditation technique. But the idea of the Four Noble Truths and like what is nirvana, what happened to the Buddha after he died, this is not something that's on the radar of some of these people. They're not really interested in that. They're interested in practical applications right here and now. Actually this whole thing towards changing the external appearance of Buddhism, it started happening the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. Master Tai Tzu and Anagarika Dhammapala and many of those people. And so they started changing more the external things, especially because there were, it was quite interesting, when Europe came in as colonial powers, then that influenced how Buddhism was. And, I read that somewhere in China they started having an organ, as instead of the usual drums and bells and things that they do. Or like you were saying, using a classroom and doing a lot more social engagement projects. Because I think they were seeing the model of the Christians and how many people, when they're benefited this lifetime by, let's say, Christian charities that come in and help them, then they convert to Christianity. And so the Buddhists were saying, hey, what's happening, Our Buddhists are becoming Christians. And then saying, oh, but well, that's because the Christians are helping them and we're not. Yeah. And so at least in China that began to change a lot, with the Buddhists really doing much more outreach and doing things for the lay people. Yeah, not just having the monastery be something just for the monastics where they practice and study. The Tibetans are still working on that, actually. Yeah, because they didn't have that same, contact with the West early on. So is there elements of more the secular mentality springing up in traditional societies? Yeah, you mean like in traditional Asian societies? Yeah, it really depends. I would say in Singapore, yes, there's some Buddhists are really some are being very traditional, some are being more secular, and here not just in the external appearance of like having classrooms or whatever, but maybe also in terms of their views or how they're spreading the Dharma. I think that's happening more now, kind of seeing Buddhism for, as mental health and right. But that's usually how it is in the West too, that the secular centers charge, and so it's a different setup than the traditional monastery or temple. Yeah. So I think in some societies like like Singapore, it's going in that direction. In Taiwan, I think what they started to have in the monasteries is what they called humanistic Buddhism. And so there the monastics themselves are emphasizing more on Buddhist relationships in this lifetime and how Buddhism can help you in this very lifetime. They're still teaching the traditional view, but maybe bringing people in primarily by the more thing of how Buddhism can help you now and how we can create a pure land on earth. Many of them are emphasizing that. Yeah. But the teachings of traditional Buddhism quite definitely remain there in the traditional societies. I think in traditional societies, even the people who are doing the more secular approach, everybody still believes in rebirth. Yeah, and everybody, even if they're doing more the secular approach, they still have a lot of respect for the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and they accept the Four Noble Truths and have a perspective of multiple lifetimes. I think it's more in Western cultures where those elements that are kind of one of the fundamental things on which things are based are being discarded because it's not part of the culture. Whereas in Asian cultures, those ideas are, people were brought up with them. Yeah? Okay, so why is secular Buddhism called Buddhism? Why not just call it mindfulness practice or something like that? Some people are doing that, They're teaching mindfulness. They're not calling themselves Buddhists. For example, they're teaching it in schools or in therapy situations, and they're just saying this is mindfulness training. Compassion is becoming another hot topic, like in education, but those are people who are educators who are teaching about compassion, using, teachings based on Buddhism, but not talking about past and future lives, just presenting that as something that will help people to be more compassionate, which is really good, So you have people who are they're not calling themselves Buddhists, they're just extracting these elements and teaching them in professional settings. Then you have some people who are kind of in the middle, they're more the secular Buddhists, they're teaching these things, but maybe not teaching all of the Four Noble Truths, or teaching the Four Noble Truths as a metaphor for what's happening in this life, teaching dependent origination as a metaphor for this life. Okay? So they consider themselves Buddhists, but they're not kind of teaching the whole thing of Buddhism. Okay, you're still on the board of the Northwest Dharma Association, and so you're saying there that the word Dharma has kind of, it seems like the word Dharma has replaced the word Buddhist, and people will say, I practice the Dharma, I do mindfulness, I do compassion, but I'm not really a Buddhist. Yeah, and there are many people who will go to Buddhist centers, but they don't want to call themselves Buddhists, but they might say, I practice the Dharma, or they'll say, I'm studying Buddhist teachings, but they don't want to be known as Buddhists. Yeah. And then there's, Jewish Buddhists and Catholic Buddhists and all, Yeah. Okay.